Right now is a very good time to be a fan of fighting games. Street Fighter 6 is coming out 2 days after this video, Tekken 8 is probably going to come out sometime next year, King of Fighters 15 and Guilty Gear Strive are still getting DLC, Fraymakers looks really cool, the competitive Smash community is still trying really hard despite Nintendo's best efforts, EVO just keeps getting bigger and better. If you're a fan of fighting games, there is a lot to be excited about. Me personally, I am a huge fan. I love these little things. They are just so much fun to pick up and play, and no matter how bad I am, I can't help but feel really cool when I beat my friends at games they've never even heard of. I've always been kind of in love with the genre, but lately I have been absolutely obsessed with it. So just like rhythm games and video game localization and Yakuza and community and public transportation, I have decided to turn my latest obsession into a video. I have compiled a very, very long list of fighting games, and for the next 20 to 30 minutes, I am going to be word vomiting my thoughts at all of you. So sit down, buckle up, and try not to zone out because I have a lot to say. But first, what is a fighting game? Well, for those of you who don't know, fighting games are a genre of video game that involves direct combat between two or more characters, often with a heavy emphasis on unarmed combat, the martial arts aesthetic, and a technique and skill-based gameplay loop comprised of mechanics and concepts such as combos, blocking, grabbing, counterattacking, and special attacks. The concept is universal, but the execution can vary wildly. Fighting games can be 1v1, 2v2, 3v3, free-for-all, 2D, 3D, arena fighters, unarmed, armed, and can include characters that are human, animal, demons, trucks perhaps? Fighting games all have their own unique characters, styles, mechanics, techniques, and fan bases. So in theory, it can be a bit confusing to keep track of all of them, but much like skyscrapers, they all follow a similar set of principles and you know one when you see one. Oh my gosh, it's a skyscraper! That's a bus. Now, you can't talk about fighting games without talking about Street Fighter. It might not be the original fighting game franchise, but is undeniably the franchise with the largest influence on the genre. Fighting games certainly existed before Street Fighter, but they weren't... what's the word? Oh, good! They weren't good! For the most part, they didn't have combos, special moves, classes, archetypes, mechanics with any sort of depth, or large and diverse cast of characters and locations. Basically, every concept that defines the modern fighting game was introduced or popularized by Street Fighter. And as a result, Street Fighter has sort of become the default, the baseline, the blueprint. There are very few things unique about the franchise because everything Street Fighter does eventually gets copied by everyone else. Now, that's not to say that Street Fighter has become pointless or redundant because no other fighting game feels quite like Street Fighter, and I have yet to see any other fighting game produce a moment this fucking cool. I just mean that the franchise has had a massive impact on the genre and is historic and iconic for a reason. And if you're looking for an introduction to the fighting game genre, well, you might as well start with the series that nearly every other fighting game is inspired by. Marvel vs. Capcom is a fast-paced 3v3 team battle fighting game with big names and bigger combos. It's a crossover fighting game featuring a long list of fan-favorite characters from Marvel Comics and Capcom games. But unlike most pieces of crossover media, Marvel vs. Capcom's biggest selling point isn't its roster. It's the game's status as a fast-paced, inherently goofy, broken-as-hell, high-energy fighting game with combos so big and destructive that the first interaction of a game can often be the deciding factor in whether you win, lose, or get embarrassed by the world's cheesiest touch of death combo. Now, none of this is to say that the cast of characters doesn't have any effect on the game's popularity, because it definitely does, and the team behind Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite learned that one the hard way. I just mean that the character roster has long since stopped being the deciding factor in Marvel vs. Capcom's popularity. Fans of the series stick around through thick and thin because of the game's fast pace, huge combos, high skill ceiling, and low barrier to entry. Speaking of fast-paced, high-energy 3v3 team battlers with a heavy heavy emphasis on crazy combos and a roster of fan-favorite characters from our childhoods, Dragon Ball FighterZ is the game that Marvel vs. Capcom fans fled to when the latest game in their favorite franchise showed up dead on arrival. And for good reason too. The game is awesome. Basically everything I said about Marvel vs. Capcom applies to Dragon Ball FighterZ. The fast pace, the big combos, the recognizable cast of characters, the low barrier to entry, it's all here. The game seems almost intentionally designed to occupy the same space as Marvel, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Especially when the developers of DBZF took special care to ensure that their game stood apart from its competitors and carved its own niche. Dragon Ball FighterZ sets itself apart from similar games through its emphasis on projectiles and zoning, a laundry list of unique mechanics, a combat system that overwhelmingly relies on timing and punishment, and a comeback system that ensures that even at death's door, you still have a chance at victory. But more than anything, Dragon Ball FighterZ's biggest selling point is its unique art style. The game developers at Arc System Works created the game's art style using a series of unique animation methods that painstakingly combine cell shading and a billion other techniques that I am way too stupid to explain or even just understand to create the illusion of hand-drawn 2D animation in a 3D space and perfectly recreate the Dragon Ball art style. Speaking of Arc System games with absolutely insane art styles, Guilty Gear is a franchise that I only recently got into, but it is quickly becoming my favorite fighting game franchise of all time. There is a lot that could be said about Guilty Gear, but what I find particularly interesting about the franchise is that it masquerades as a very simple game. It doesn't have the same laundry list of special moves and complicated inputs that the genre is known for. Instead, each character has a very small list of special moves, many of which are tied to universal inputs. As a result, Guilty Gear is a very simple game, at least on the surface, but in actuality, it is one of the most complex and technical fighting games I have ever played. There are a lot of balls in the air, and not just because of that one guy that actually fights using floating balls. The series has a lot of complicated and unique mechanics that a new player won't understand or even know about, and at first, they won't need to, but by the time they finally realize that there is more to this game than meets the eye, they are already getting absolutely bitch slapped to hell and back, and they are going to have to spend a lot of time playing catch up. Half the fun of Guilty Gear is the learning process, and the other half is just how stylish everything is. Mortal Kombat is a very unique case because while I could talk about its gameplay or its history or its mechanics or its character roster, that's not really what anybody wants to hear me talk about. They want me to talk about its overt brutality. Mortal Kombat is insanely violent. So violent that in a genre entirely focused on putting two people in an arena and having them beat the living shit out of each other, Mortal Kombat still managed to build its entire reputation on being the most violent kid on the playground. Brutality, fatality. Mortal Kombat is infamous for the way it drew kids to the ultra violence in an era where that sort of thing wasn't as readily at their fingertips as it is today. It's a franchise so violent that it was discussed at length in a Senate hearing about violence in video games, and it is at least partially responsible for the creation of the video game rating system. Now you can't tell me that that's not metal as fuck. The weird thing about Mortal Kombat is that it shouldn't appeal to me at all. I find the gameplay too slow, the movement too clunky, the character roster does nothing to me, and I can't figure out how to do most of the inputs, and yet, I am still innately drawn to Mortal Kombat, because despite all my bleeding heart, social activist, peace for all mankind bullshit, at the end of the day, I am still just a stupid animal that loves seeing that one guy rip the other guy's head off. Tekken differs from the other fighting games we've discussed so far because it is a 3D fighting game rather than a 2D one. This means that rather than restricting the characters to a flat two-dimensional plane, the players are allowed to move along an additional axis within a limited 3D space. The movement is still incredibly restrictive, but now a whole new world has opened up. This seemingly mild change recontextualizes the entire genre's movement mechanics, providing 3D fighting games with an additional layer of depth. Now, Tekken is not the original 3D fighting game. That title belongs to Virtua Fighter, but Tekken is undeniably the most popular. And also, they don't really make Virtua Fighter games anymore, do they? You snooze, you lose, Sega. Of course, the number of Ds is far from the only thing differentiating Tekken from its peers. The series is mainly famous for its insane laundry list of special moves and its absolutely massive character roster that includes a bear, a dinosaur, a tree, and a kangaroo? What the fuck is this game? And of course, Tekken is also known for the interesting way in which the franchise's combos work. Instead of railroading the player into focusing on how long they can keep an opponent knocked down like in other fighting games, Tekken also encourages the player to see how long they can juggle their opponent in the air. Unfortunately, I'm not good enough at this or any game to provide an adequate demonstration, so you're just gonna have to take my word at face value for a lot of what I say. Another interesting thing about Tekken is the fact that it subverts the traditional fighting game trope of light and heavy punches by binding each button to a specific limb instead of using buttons to determine the strength of an attack. For instance, the triangle button controls the left arm and the X button controls the right leg, and so on and so forth. It's a tad unorthodox, but it does create a fighting game that looks and feels far more realistic than the rest of the genre, which is admittedly a weird thing to say about a game with sentient trees, demon blood magic, and martial arts tournaments that let robots and bears compete, but what do I know? I'm not even good at the game. Speaking of 3D fighting games with unique design priorities, SoulCalibur is a particularly unique fighting game, not only because it is a fighting game with the option to win by knocking your opponent out of the arena, but also because it is the only fighting game I have ever played where the emphasis is placed on weapons rather than hand-to-hand combat. That's not to say that other fighting games don't have characters with weapons in them, because almost all of them do, just that in other fighting games, weapons are often unique to specific characters and serve as a way to show off a character's unique personality or diversify a roster's movesets. It is very rare that the weapons are the main focus or even a core gameplay mechanic. SoulCalibur, on the other hand, provides each character with a unique weapon that directly reflects on their unique personalities and the cultures that they were designed to represent. This, combined with the series' emphasis on building movesets around the weapons and creating an illusion of technique and realistic weapon play, allows SoulCalibur to really stand out as a truly unique game. That being said, it's not really what this series is known for. The thing that usually keeps SoulCalibur in the public eye is its crazy history of guest fighters. The series has featured many beloved and iconic characters, such as Zelda from Zelda, the Dilf from Tekken, that guy that used to play Superman but doesn't anymore, Gosh of War, Darth Vader, and the sex bot from that one game that all my friends keep telling me to play. Continuing on the topic of fighting games taking place in a 3D plane, arena fighters are an interesting subcategory of 3D fighting games because they are the only fighting game subgenre where everything fucking sucks. Now, I'll admit, that's a bit of an overgeneralization, and statistically, at least one of these games has to be good. But if it's out there, I haven't found it yet. Update, I found it. It's Budokai Tenkaichi. For those of you who don't know, an arena fighter is a fighting game that exists on a 3D plane, but it differs from traditional 3D fighters by allowing the characters free reign over a wide open space and providing a camera that follows their movement rather than restricting the players to a set path. In theory, this actually sounds kind of fun, but where the subgenre fails to maintain any sense of quality is in its clumsy movement, its railroading of combo mechanics, its oversimplification of extremely necessary genre conventions, and its single-minded emphasis on button masher gameplay. As a result, arena fighters tend to feel less like fighting games and more like a mediocre and homogenized reimagining of beloved retro 2D beat-em-ups. And I cannot emphasize its homogeneity enough, because when you repeatedly simplify a genre way past what is necessary, you'll eventually hit a point where every game starts to feel the same. So if arena fighters are so bad, why are they so successful? Because the companies that make them are catering to the lowest common denominator: anime fans. Oh, hey, it's me! I mean, it's no secret that anime fans will watch fucking anything, so it should go without saying that they'd probably also be down to play fucking anything too. And with battle anime lending themselves so perfectly to the arena fighter genre, well, the combination of the two was all but inevitable. Dragon Ball Xenoverse, My Heroes One Justice, Demon Slayer, Pokken Tournament. I actually kinda like this one. That one Naruto game with the awful fucking incomprehensible name. And of course, Jump Force, a game so good that you can't even play it anymore because Namdai Bamco turned off online connectivity, ended production of physical copies, and delisted the digital version from online stores. This genre is such a clusterfuck! Now, I know what you're thinking, but Josh, if you hate these games so much, why do you play so many of them? Look, I may be a hater, but I also grew up watching an unhealthy amount of anime. So I eat this shit up like it's tacos and tostadas, and I walk away disappointed because oopsie doopsie, I ordered from fucking Chipotle again. Is a franchise so good and so unique that it spawned an entire subgenre of fighting games. The platform fighter. Platform fighters differ from other fighting games by featuring faster movement, a heavier emphasis on aerial combat, simpler special move inputs, and an emphasis on beating your opponent by knocking them off screen instead of reducing their health bar to 0. Smash is widely believed to be the first ever platform fighter, which actually might not be true, but I'm too lazy to fact check that. But it is undoubtedly the most popular platform fighter, thanks in no small part to its fast pace, smooth movement, low barrier to entry, and deceptively complex mechanics. But, of course, its main selling point is its roster. You see, Smash is a crossover fighting game featuring iconic characters and locations from all across the gaming industry. It was originally created featuring only content from Nintendo's most popular franchises before expanding to feature characters, locations, and items from damn near all of them, and then eventually allowing peasant third parties like Sonic and Cloud into the mix. Cut to the franchise's most recent entry, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, and Smash has gone from a cute little crossover fighting game featuring Nintendo icons to a monument to the history of the video game industry. It's pretty great and quite literally has a little something for everyone. If you're looking for a game with a tight-knit and highly competitive community, play Melee. If you're hoping for some fast-paced party game fun, you can't go wrong with Smash 4. If you're in the mood for some single-player offerings, you gotta play Brawl. If you hate fun, 64 is where it's at. And if you want a little bit of everything, and I quite literally mean everything, just play Smash Ultimate. Smash is not my favorite franchise on the list, but it is the game that I've been playing for the longest, both in terms of years as a fan and hours spent playing. And no matter how much I hate this stupid fucking game, I can't help but love it too. Directly inspired by Super Smash Bros., but actively trying to make a name for itself as a standalone game, Rivals of Aether is a fast-paced, highly competitive indie platform fighter with a heavy emphasis on highly aggressive in-your-face gameplay and individual character gimmicks. Unlike most fighting games, Rivals has no shield or grab mechanics, opting instead for a simple but unforgiving parry ability. As a result, the gameplay of Rivals of Aether is far more aggressive and movement-based than many of its peers, platform and traditional alike. Furthermore, each character is themed around one of the 4 classical elements of air, water, earth, and fire. Not to be confused with Earth, Wind, and Fire, which is a really good band, or Animal, Vegetable, Mineral Man, which is a fucked up comic book character. As a result of its unique theming, the characters in Rivals end up being very memorable and unorthodox, with each character's moveset being built off of a personality archetype, a fighting game class, and an elemental gimmick. And then of course there's the guest characters Shovel Knight and Ori, who don't really fit into the game's central theme, but I love them and their home franchises so much that I don't even care. But what Rivals is perhaps best known for is its robust and comprehensive character customizer that lets you make anything. And I really mean anything. Mario, Goku, former President Barack Obama, Sans Undertale, the devil himself. It's fucking crazy. Brawlhalla is a free-to-play platform fighter with a heavy emphasis on appealing to a more casual audience, and you can definitely tell. The gameplay is incredibly simple, a lot of the movesets and characters feel very similar, a significant portion of the roster is locked behind paywalls, and there is a heavier emphasis on item use and free-for-alls. None of this means that the game is bad in any capacity, just that it's it's geared to a significantly more casual audience, which is actually something that the fighting game genre desperately needs. It's also a very funny thing to consider when you think about the fact that the entire platform fighter subgenre, and most of the games in it, were already designed to cater to casual gamers. That's not to say that Brawlhalla doesn't have any room for more competitive players. The game does have a ranked multiplayer mode and a very high skill ceiling, and when someone actually puts in the effort to get good at the game, they are terrifying. Brawlhalla isn't really my thing, but I did put a few hours into it back when I first got my PS4 and didn't have any other games, and I acknowledge its quality. It's definitely a great game for beginners, and if you're just now getting into platform fighters or even fighting games in general, I'd definitely recommend using a game like Brawlhalla to test the waters before committing to a $60 price tag. But it is important to remember that Brawlhalla is a very unique take on what is already a subgenre, and most fighting games, including platform fighters, feel and play very different. But again, everyone has his art somewhere, and Brawlhalla ain't exactly a bad place to get your feet wet. Alright, so I don't exactly have the time or knowledge to talk about every fighting game in existence, but there are still a lot more games that I wanted to at least mention, so here's a quick lightning round of games that just couldn't quite make the cut. Injustice is a fighting game where Batman kills Superman. Other than that, it's basically a less brutal Mortal Kombat. Skullgirls is an incredibly fun and highly technical team battle fighting game that unfortunately lives or dies by its gorgeous and unique art style, which basically means that everybody playing it is doing so because they like the way it looks, and everybody who is refusing to play it is doing so because they don't. Virtua Fighter is the first 3D fighting game ever, and that is basically the only thing anyone ever says about it. I'm only just now starting to play King of Fighters, but it's a lot of fun so far, and it has some really cool characters. Like, look at Maiden-kun! He's just a sleepy little guy! Pokken Tournament is a fun game with a dead competitive scene. Fraymakers is Smash Bros for indie games. Battle Construction Vehicles is a fighting game where all of the characters are construction equipment, but it still doesn't manage to be as ridiculous as Dengeki Bunko Fighting Climax, a fighting game that pits characters like Tiger from Toradora against characters like Akira from Virtua Fighter, Mikoto Misaka from A Certain Scientific Railgun, and Kirito's Sword Art Online. Bloody Roar lets you release your inner furry. Primal Rage lets you release your inner scaly, and Them's Fighting Herds lets you release your inner jar lover. Multiversus is a poorly thought out ad campaign for HBO Max, and Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl is a love letter to fans of classic Nickelodeon. But both dev teams put so much time and effort into making a cool roster that they forgot to make an actually good game, and that's why nobody plays either anymore. Fight of Animals is a dead meme graveyard that actually manages to be a lot of fun despite not being funny. Slap City actually is funny. Balls and Clayfighter exist, no one can deny that. I hate ARMS, I'm not quite sure how I feel about BlazBlue, and even though I've never played Melty Blood, I've heard nothing but good things about it, and I really wanted the video to end on a positive note. Okay, I think that might be everything. Shit!